Hello everyone, it's the librarian. We are back with chapter 3 and 4 of The Insomniacs by Marit Weisenberg. Chapter 3, Saturday, April 2nd. It wasn't that I'd wanted to stop going over to Van's house. It was that I'd simply imploded inside when I saw the boys the morning my dad left. They were waiting for me on the street as usual and witnessed the end of it all. I remembered them in a row, stunned, as my dad walked to the waiting black town car, blatantly ignoring my cries. When the car pulled out, it ran over the tire of my bike that I'd left in the driveway the night before. The sedan kept going, my mangled tire popping out from under it, like a demented jack-in-the-box. Max looked at me, then at my mom, and in a moment I would never forget, he cracked up. It was the reaction of a kid. I knew that now, but it still haunted me, the humiliation of my strong mother crying, the sound of my friend's laughter at her tears. The world of a 9-year-old is free and open, or at least I'd felt that way on our cul-de-sac, and then bam, I saw everything as a landscape of division, like tiles in a mosaic. It actually wasn't so different from the moment on the diving board. Everything went still for a second. I felt naked, and then there was a fracture. Later that day, I discovered Van's old bike on my doorstep. A note written in Van's handwriting was taped to the handlebars and read, "You can have this." As soon as I saw the present, I quietly wheeled it to a dark corner of my garage and never touched it. For some reason, I couldn't. For years, whenever I glimpsed Van's bike in the corner, I thought of it as the pity bike. Eventually, I forgot about it until one day I saw the little girl from next door on it, flying past. Now, I was embarrassed that I never thanked Van, or gave the bike back, or played with the boys again. At first, they'd avoided me, probably out of awkwardness. But then, they'd knocked on my door a few times to see if I could play. I didn't answer, and they finally quit trying. They seamlessly tightened without me, and no one beside my mom questioned why I was no longer a part of things. Now, 7 years later, I stood on the sidewalk in front of Van Tagawa's beautiful home. I heard the distinctive rattle of my mom's aged Kelly green BMW station wagon behind me as she pulled out of our garage, headed to work. Her eyes surely on me as she drove past. I spun to catch a glimpse of her, but I was too late. Instead, I saw our house across the street. Painted white, though the color had been on a dingy gray cast. The thatch of weeds in front made it stand out from every other house on the block, except for the now vacant one next door. My goodness, guys, that's traumatizing. I wouldn't want to talk to those people either. I eyed the greenbelt in the encroached darkness, the cedar elm forest black against the lighter sky. Who had been breaking in so close to my house? From what my mother had heard, the electronics had been stripped out. Everyone speculated that a homeless person had come up from the greenbelt and then spread the word about a place to sleep. I didn't even want to know about the night foot traffic that had always passed through our block from the trailhead that led into the wild wilderness. Everyone had paid for beautiful views, but knew to secure their doors when the sun went down. In the near dark, an outdoor lighting scheme thoughtfully highlighted the spare native plants and clustering oaks at Van's. I was just across the street from my house, but it was like escaping to a different world, a Disneyland. In addition to being beautiful, Van's was the fun house, the one where all the kids had always hung out. Everything about Van and his home, in my opinion, perfect. The house was a large 2-story made of silvery Texas limestone with a bronze metal roof. Olive trees flaked the path to the front door. Lush emerald squares of evenly cut grass to either side. The sounds of Van's 3 younger brothers playing soccer carried from the backyard. With my mom out of sight, I considered immediately going home, but when I glanced around, of course, someone was watching me. Someone was always watching someone on Scarlet View. Max was a distance away, but we made eye contact as he walked across the street, presumably to find Wilson after being separated for only a matter of minutes. It occurred to me that it had been weeks since I saw Van hanging out with his 2 best friends. I paused on Van's front step and glanced behind me. Max was now at Wilson's door, but still observing me. For a long moment, Max steadily held my eyes, not betraying if he was surprised that I was standing on Van's property for the first time since I was 9. Max's fiery red hair stood out in the dusk. He also had intense freckles to match, which had faded only marginally over time. Maybe from years of being teased about his freckles, Max always struck first, his sense of humor cutting. Yet, when we were only 7, Max was the one who had carried me on his back for more than a mile when we all got lost in the woods and I twisted my ankle slipping in a creek. Just last week, there was a moment when my car strained to start in the driveway, and in my rearview mirror, I saw Max begin to jog across the street to offer his help. Max's parental supervision was almost zero, even though his hippie parents had retired early after selling their fruit leather business for millions. Wilson's parents, on the other hand, watched their only child's every move. Wilson's mother was originally from India and a successful restaurateur. Wilson was named after his other mom, Leah Wilson, a Texan, carrying on her Southern family's surname. Just then, Wilson came out of his house. He joined Max on the doorstep and plopped down on the bench, gracing the wide porch, sprawling his legs out in front of him, folding his fingers over his middle. Wilson was tall and lanky with longish, silky black curls and doe eyes that made him look internally innocent. I still couldn't reconcile this 7-year-old Wilson my friends thought was so sexy with the little kid I'd splashed with in the creek wearing nothing but my Hello Kitty underwear. Now, both boys' eyes were on me. I realized I was staring back at them. I remembered where I was standing, and I was about to quickly knock when Van's mom whipped the front door wide open, surprising us both. "Ingrid!" She put a hand on her heart. "Hi, Miss Moore." She relaxed and smiled. "I don't think you've ever called me Miss Moore. Always Lisa. I was just getting the mail. How are you feeling?" She touched my shoulder very gently, like she was worried I might break. "Oh, fine," I said, like it wasn't a big deal, as if I didn't have staples in my head. "I'm glad you're good. Concussions are terrible." She sucked in a breath. "That's bystander. Yikes." I made myself look into her expectant cornflower blue eyes. I missed her. Everyone loved Lisa, a former preschool teacher. She was the parent who had played with us, stretched out on her stomach on the living room floor. One time early on a Saturday morning, Lisa had painted my nails while we waited for Van to wake up. Before Mary Seatsman moved onto our cul-de-sac, I was the only girl, and I loved being doted on. Back then, I took it for granted. I just wanted to say thanks for tracking my mom down at work after the accident. My coach probably had her number buried in paperwork, but it would have taken a while to find it. Of course, we all look out for each other, Lisa said. It didn't feel fake coming from Lisa, but we hadn't been part of her circle for a long time. Thanks again. It would appease my mom if I said thank you to Lisa. I was about to say goodbye and head home to rest my head and stare at the ceiling when one of the twins, Anthony I guessed, knocked into Lisa and she caught herself on the doorframe in a whirlwind. Gus, the other twin, came in a close second and shouted over his brother, who was actively telling on him. Lisa was immediately thrown into a whirl of chaos and negotiations. I cleared my throat, which jarred my head and made me acutely aware of the circumference of my skull. Bye, thank you so much, Lisa, I croaked. I was concerned about the tendrils of cold that had begun to spread through my limbs, always a precursor to throwing up. Lisa barely looked up, but opened the front door even wider and gestured for me to come in quickly before their bull terrier escaped. No, Stella. To my horror, Lisa grabbed my arm, pulled me into the rectangular entryway, and slammed the door shut just as Stella's muscular gray body heaved into it, then slipped on the carpet. Her paws were muddy, and Lisa grabbed Stella's collar to pull her into the large, bright kitchen just to my left. Van's brother ran behind and in front of their mother, almost tripping her. Van's stepdad sat at the white marble kitchen island, his back to me, laptop out and loaded with stock market data. Phone in hand, his large frame was bear-like. Kevin didn't look up at the fighting or help Lisa as she struggled with Stella near the kitchen fireplace. But then he twisted slowly on the bar stool and gave me a smile. Van's in his room, he said. Oh, I've got to go, I said quickly and brushed my unkempt sick bed hair from my face. Nah, go on up, he coaxed. He seemed to laugh at some private joke as he turned back to his screen. The picture frames on the entryway table caught my eye. They all showed the Moore family, blonde, with the stark exception of Van, and smiling on different expensive vacations. All the way in the back, I saw a token picture of Van's dad. In the photo, he appeared much younger than any parent I knew today, but he had been pretty young when he died. He looked so similar to Van, with the same high cheekbones and direct amber eyes. Van had been 5 when he moved onto our street with his mom and her new husband. Lisa had been very open about being widowed and remarrying, and I remembered every detail of what the neighbors had repeated to one another when the Moore Tagawas first arrived. Van's Japanese-American dad had died less than a year before. He had been a medical resident, and he'd been killed changing his tire on the side of the road. Lisa didn't mention the last part. Someone discovered it in a Google search. Before Van's arrival, Wilson and Max and I had been our own tight circle. We'd let other kids play with us, but no one became a lasting member of the group. When Van confidently wandered over to where we were setting up our orange cones that read "Kids at Play," that all changed. Almost immediately, we became a foursome, but we divided into 2 teams, Wilson and Max, me and Van. If Max and Wilson were like my brothers, Van was my best friend. I remembered feeling like I recognized him instantly, that we already knew each other somehow. I'd never felt that way before, or since. Van's stepdad was still watching me, expectant. Okay, I heard myself say. Why in the world had I just agreed to go up to Van's room? I recognized the adrenaline rush and the urge to challenge myself. It was my response to fear. My coach had pointed it out. Consistent, explode. In 1 week, I could learn 3 new dives. He said it was the quality that made me continuously level up. Now I had that same feeling. I craved and hated the sensation. Exciting and horrible. I took the narrow staircase, freshly painted, on a regular basis to cover the boys' greasy handprints. At the top of the stairs, the house more closely resembled what I remembered from years and years ago. The artwork was the same, and so was the long runner that ran the length of the landing, and was always bunched from kids tearing through the house. Van's room was 2 doors down to the right, and could hear the sound of lyrics born calling out. A song I knew because Van had played it nonstop the past month, and it carried through his open window. Pretty soon it would be so much hotter, and Van would shut his windows, and it would be another year before I knew what he was listening to. He had great taste, in my opinion, except for the hits he'd played that were produced by my dad. I always wondered if he knew they were his. Then I'd think, of course he does. The bedroom door was partially open. I touched the handle, and my heart began to pound. Van? I said softly. Too softly, apparently. My eyes caught on the Zildjian poster on the wall straight ahead. It was identical to the one my dad had given me when I was little. The drum kit and the giant cymbal. It had been flattened, but white creases married the print, and it occurred to me that it might be the exact poster that had hung on my wall before I'd crumpled it up and jammed it in the trash. I was wrapping my mind around that when, from the corner of my eye, there was a flurry of movement. Van shot up quickly from his bed and stood next to it. Then I got all the confirmation I ever wanted or needed that they were, in fact, dating. When Caroline Kelly sat up, much more slowly behind him, she looked down at the front of her shirt as though making sure it was buttoned all the way. Oh my goodness, that's so embarrassing, guys. I unfroze. Sorry, I quickly turned and left the room. He was nothing to me. This didn't matter. There was no reason to want to be sick. Ingrid? I looked back at Van, who'd followed me into the hallway. My cheeks were flaming. I bet. Oh my goodness. He was barefoot and wore jeans and a band t-shirt. He looked completely unflustered. His eyes dropped to my chest for a millisecond, and I instinctively pulled the old t-shirt I'd been wearing for 2 days away from my body. We both paused, not saying a word. I hadn't heard him say my name since 8th grade. He was waiting for me to speak to explain why the hell I just walked into his bedroom. Van Tagawa's inner sanctum. Which Van was he? The one I'd played Legos with? The one who had not accidentally held my hand in 8th grade? Or the one who was 6'2", gorgeous, and a king of our school? I found my voice. I came by to say thanks for helping my mom last week and for trying to get on the deck. Oh God, why did I mention that? It wasn't like I'd seen it. I'd just heard many reports from the other girls on the team about his arguing to get down to the restricted swim deck post-accident. Van gave me the smile I'd watched other girls receive over the past few years. I can't believe those assholes wouldn't let me down there. Oh, it was actually true. My eyes rested on his for a long, quiet moment. Caroline swung out of the bedroom to join us, side by side. It was insane. What a striking couple they made. My mom once said Caroline looked exactly like a young Sybil Shepherd in the last picture show and pulled up an image. She was correct down to their shared honey blonde hair and slightly perfect upturned nose. My mom had called Caroline heartbreakingly beautiful. "Hey, you walked out," Caroline asked me. Not waiting for my answer, she added, "I gotta go." "I'll walk you home," Van offered. No, I got it. I want to talk to Ingrid." Van was about to say something to me when Caroline reached up and grasped his face in both of her hands, commanding his undivided attention. Then she very slowly kissed him. I realized I was staring. I started for the stairs. My face beat red again. Then I heard Caroline fall in line behind me. Thankfully, the downstairs had emptied of the Moore clan. Stella, now abandoned, licked the kitchen floor. I realized what was behind Van's stepdad's smile. He'd known I'd walk in on Van and Caroline. He was teasing Van, who probably thought he was getting away with having his girlfriend upstairs. Nice. Kevin had always loved to rib Van. It seemed to be his way of subtly and not so subtly reminding Van that he was the boss. Caroline and I let ourselves out and walked single file down the pathway to the sidewalk. It wasn't yet twilight, but dim light shone from the cul-de-sac's 2 street lamps. I wanted to hit the rewind button 1,000,000 times over. I bet that's really embarrassing, don't you think, guys? Caroline halted on the sidewalk and faced me. "How are you doing?" She moved closer and boldly reached out to touch the back of my head, somehow instinctively knowing exactly where my staples were. Her fingers on the matted ridge. I was tall and willowy like my mom, and she was short and petite. I felt gawky next to her. "I'm good. I'll be back sooner than a month, I'm sure," I lied. I hoped I sounded calm. Caroline dropped her hand. I took a half step back. "God, I hope so." She made this sound like a remote possibility, like I had a long haul in front of me. "I hate practice without you." When a senior like her said that to a junior like me, it was hard not to feel special. Caroline stretched long, like a cat. Her graceful arms extended up and out, unafraid to take up space. Chin tilted to the sky. She was so California beautiful, it wasn't even funny. She was also nice, so it was impossible to hate her. Why him? She could have had anyone she wanted. "You don't mind, do you?" she asked, and pointed loosely in the direction of Van's room. "Why would I mind?" I asked. Izzy had once said that I was hard to read. I hoped she was right. "Oh, I don't know. That was a dumb thing to say. It's not like you want a boyfriend anyway." Caroline must have felt me stiffen. "What I mean is you don't have the time. That's what it takes if you want to go to nationals. I remember with gymnastics," she said, wistful. Back in San Diego, Caroline had been a gymnastics superstar. She was one of the very few people I knew who understood what was asked of you if you wanted to perform at a higher level. A lone police car swept onto the cul-de-sac on its sporadic patrol since the break-ins, its lights temporarily illuminating us as it looped the street. "I didn't know you and Van lived so close to each other." "He's the boy next door," Caroline said. "The boy across the street." I acted like it was a joke, not a big deal at all. Just before spring break, a teammate had asked me who the best male soccer player was at our school. I'd named Van. I hadn't known Caroline. The only other diver who went to my high school was seated right behind me. That was all I had said, but it was as though I had flagged Van and put him on Caroline's radar. because the next thing I knew, I heard the rumors about them at school, and then I saw him in the stands at the meet, just moments before I messed up. He said, "You're named after Ingrid Bergman?" My accident had given them a reason to talk about me. Why would he tell her that? Why would he remember? At my lack of response, Caroline supplied, "I saw Casablanca's once with my mom. Then, see you at school?" I wanted to get away from her, and I wanted her to stay because she made me feel safe in the dark. Bad things didn't happen to someone like Caroline. "See you tomorrow," I said. Caroline began her walk home, strolling leisurely down the center of my street while I crossed to my house. But Caroline had one more thing to say. "Don't worry," she called over one slimmer shoulder. "It's just a little injury. I had one in gymnastics before I moved to Texas." She'd once told me it was her injury that forced her to quit. And that is the end of chapter 3. Now we are in chapter 4. That was a little snooty of her. Don't you guys think? Why would you say it's not a big deal to have an injury when you yourself were forced to change sports because of said injury? Anyway, chapter 4, Sunday, April 3rd. For hours already, I tried to sleep, full of optimism that tonight would be the night. I tucked myself in at 9:30 p.m. My body cocooned into the comforting divot in the middle of the bed, but now the start of school was only 6 hours away. I had to rise in 5 to shower and get ready. My heart began to pound from the worry and anxiety of not falling asleep. I tried not to think about Van, or the pain, or about the medication I couldn't take because I wasn't supposed to mask the headaches in the first phase of the concussion. The house popped, then settled. Maybe if the lights were on downstairs, I could rest more easily. Any prowlers next door would think twice about breaking and entering or walking through my backyard. I kicked off my top sheet and sat very still for a moment to see how the headache would land when I was upright. Every pain was stronger. My mom always said everything seemed worse in the middle of the night. When I had wrapped my mind around the full extent of the pain, I made my move downstairs. I started with checking the locks on the windows. My dad had loved windows. Maybe left over from his LA Canyon living days. He designed this house from Los Angeles, where he'd been living with my mother at the time. In her version of the story, he wouldn't let her interfere with the planning at all, even though she had great taste herself. She happily relinquished the job to him because she didn't give a shit about the details. He had been insane about each and every one. My father fell in love with Austin when he came to work on an album. He convinced my mother that it was a great place to raise their kids. Anyway, from the pressures of LA, according to my mom, my dad would say he was building my pregnant mom a nest, a beautiful house in an area where they had few friends and she was far away from the action of her career. Ugh, that's rude. In her early teens, my mom, an only child, had relocated to Santa Barbara from Sweden for my grandfather's job in oil and gas. When her parents returned to Stockholm a few years later, she stayed behind for college. She told me Southern California had felt like the promised land and she never wanted to leave. She was also in love with the Pacific Ocean, the palms, the warmth. As a young actress living in LA, she'd met my father through the same clique of fashionable friends, a collection of other artists, most of whom went on to become known. But back then, they had all been getting their start. As my mother told it, she was the first to have a big breakthrough. She was cast as one of the leads in a TV show, an elaborate sci-fi fantasy. The only problem? It was a multi-year commitment to film in Ireland. Newly engaged, my mother turned it down. She assumed there would be other offers, and then I was born. The series went on to have an award-winning 7 seasons. Sometimes, when my mom would stare out the kitchen windows at the large, untamed backyard and scrabbled wall of Greenbelt, I imagined her thinking, "How the hell did I end up in Central Texas?" I switched on the lights and dimmed them in the sparse living room, occupied by 2 white leather sofas we never sat in. My dad loved windows. He didn't like window shades, which was weird because he was the most private guy. But then, my father hadn't lived here much, given that he kept getting called back to LA for work, commuting home to see us on the weekends. I backed out of the living room swiftly before anyone could spy on me through the windows. My head briefly swam. Down a short hall, I made my way to the quiet kitchen, graced with appliances that were once top-of-the-line trendy, but showed their age now. They also no longer worked very well. The floorboard under the dishwasher was pliable and moldy from an unexpected leak. White walls, white subway tile, white marble counters, large windows, no shades, and unusable round table with plastic space-age-looking swivel chairs, padded with orange seat cushions. That sounds ugly, personally. My mom had scrubbed the kitchen clean before she'd left for work, even though neither of us cooked. We existed mainly on bars and frozen entrees from Trader Joe's. Continuing through the downstairs, I opened the door to my mother's room, the master suite, and bent at the side of her low Danish modern platform bed to switch on a lamp. Clothes had been thrown on the end of the bed, a navy blue bra, a pair of sweats, half the bed unslept in. The same paperback copy of The Girl on the Train had sat on her bedside table for months. The room smelled like her lavender shampoo, and I wanted to call her, a pang in my stomach at wishing she was here. If I called, what was she supposed to say, though? Being afraid was my problem. I never, ever called her at work, and I knew she barely had time to look at her phone during her shift. There were a few more rooms to check downstairs, but I decided to bypass the one with the closed doors, the 2 guest rooms with their own bathrooms. We kept the doors shut to save on heating and cooling. I didn't know if my mom ever went in to clean or if she ignored those rooms. One, my dad's old studio, and the other, a bedroom for non-existent guests. The last time I'd entered, the unused rooms were beginning to take on the musty smell of an unoccupied house, ready to deteriorate as soon as you stopped living in it. Midway up the staircase, I looked below and surveyed my work. I held the stair rail as a precaution. I had a flash of a scenario where my life easily spiraled out of control, a fall that led to a worse injury, which led to sitting out longer from diving, which led to never going back. For a second, I saw just how easy it would be to disappear. That's dark. Okay. Upstairs, the house didn't feel as huge. There was my large bedroom, my Jack and Jill bathroom, connecting the other bedroom for an additional child who'd never arrived. The upstairs was more intimate with a cozy den over the garage where my mom and I watched TV and ate together on the nights we found ourselves home at the same time. It completed the 5-bedroom, 4-bathroom, large empty house, filled with the two of us, just keeping our heads above water and pretending that was anything but the case. Now that lights were on in almost every room, the house surely glowed from the outside. Back in my room, I stood at the window and lifted the taped shade very gently, just a few inches out. If my room was dark, no one could see in, but I could see out. Van's stepdad, Kevin, smoked a cigarette outside in their front yard, a sign that the old battle between Lisa and Kevin waged on. Other than Kevin, the street was quiet. Balls and bikes put away, doors locked, everyone sleeping peacefully. The portable basketball hoop in the Love's driveway loomed like a dinosaur over 2 matching Lexus SUVs. The greenbelt made a beautiful halo arcing between the line of homes. Kevin stubbed out his cigarette and walked back inside. From my large street-facing window, there were 3 houses I could see well. The Mortagawas, the Loves, and the Kaplans. From the smaller window on my right, I had a side view of the Smiths, or what I now thought of as the abandoned house. Partially obscured by a cluster of live oaks, when all the strings had finally broken on my Roman shades, my mom hadn't bothered with a temporary paper shade for that window. The side of the house was much more private, but for all I knew, the family that had lived there could have been as attuned to my habits as I was to Van's. That's a little creepy. It had become part of my bedtime routine to check if Van's bedroom light was on. Then I'd think about him. What he'd worn that day, if he'd glanced my way in class. For about 5 whole seconds before I fell asleep. It was the dumb thing I did. Everything else in my life had a purpose. I turned to my beat-up leather backpack that lay on my desk. Folders and books perfectly organized, homework complete, even though the teachers had said I could turn everything in late. As I sifted through some of the work, I realized I didn't remember doing it. It was like a monster had taken over my body. That's exactly what it felt like in those moments over the past few days, when I'd swayed on my feet because I was so incredibly tired. I could see why sleep deprivation was used as torture. Seated at my desk, I swiveled back and forth, avoiding my bed and the stress I was beginning to associate with it. The doctor had said to take naps, to set a fixed bedtime schedule because most of all, I needed to rest to heal. I stared up at the peeling stars I'd once stuck on my ceiling and wondered what to do next. A movement, a flash of light in my peripheral vision caught my attention. I turned my head. Then I froze. Uh-oh. Through the tree branches, I caught a glimpse of light in the house next door. I blinked. Then it was gone. I second-guessed myself. My eyes were so sandy and dry from not sleeping, scraping against my lids, but there had been a light on in that window. I wasn't hallucinating. I hadn't been awake that long. Very carefully, I rose to my feet. I flipped on my small desk lamp. I wanted to get a closer look from the window. As I made my way across the room, I trailed my hand on the wall to steady myself, and inadvertently caught the flimsy paper shade I had hastily taped on when I returned from Van's. Now it fell on the ground, and like the big reveal in a magic show, Van's window appeared. My eyesight adjusted. Van stood framed in his bedroom window. Every light turned on in his room.